Hello. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight to talk about eelgrass. My name is Marina, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator for the Friends of Netarts Bay, Watershed, Estuary, Beach, and Sea. That is a pretty long name, so we usually call ourselves WEBS, if you're new here and not familiar with us. And at Webb's, we work to sustain the Netarts Bay area from Cape Lookout to Cape Mears through education and stewardship. And we do that by running school field trips for Tillamook County students. We lead stewardship work outdoors in the field. We organize community education opportunities, which include both events out in the field when the weather's a little nicer and presentations like this one. So today we are learning about eelgrass with Dr. Tony D'Andrea. Tony is the project leader for ODFW's SEACOR program, which conducts bay clam population surveys and habitat surveys in all of the bays up and down the Oregon coast. So if you want to know about coastal eelgrass habitats, he is the person to talk to. This presentation is the first event in our three-part series, Producers of the Bay, which is a really fun new thing that we're doing this year, this speaker series. Next month, we will have another virtual presentation focusing on seaweeds with an added bonus of some conversation about green crab. And that presentation is also going to have a bit of a culinary twist. So we're really looking forward to that one. And in April, we're going to have an in-person event focused on phytoplankton. So we're really covering all of the producers that make up the foundation of our food chain here in the Netarts area. So I hope that you'll stay tuned for more details on those events coming out in the next couple weeks. Keep your eye on your email for our newsletter with those announcements. Now, before we get started, I just want to go through a couple housekeeping things. We are recording this presentation to avoid distractions. We're going to have everybody keep their cameras off and microphones muted. We do welcome questions though, so please go ahead and type your questions in the chat, and we're gonna save them all to the end and get to them during the Q&A. You'll notice that when you type questions into the chat, they're just going to come to us, the hosts of this webinar. They will not go out to everybody in the group, but we will keep an eye on them and save them all for the end. If you have any technology issues during this presentation, again, please let us know in the chat. We will keep an eye on that and do our best to troubleshoot. You can also reach out to us at info@netartsbaywebs.org, which is up on the screen here. I have that email account open on my computer, so I'm going to keep an eye on that as well. So if you can't use the chat for any reason, you can get in touch with me that way for the next hour and a half. And final thing, we're keeping the chat reserved for questions and technology issues, and we're really excited to have everyone here and just want to have sort of a quick reminder that we're all here to learn and enjoy hearing about this presentation and just be respectful of each other and of the presenters and everything that we have going on. So if you have any additional comments or feedback that you're interested in sharing, we would love to continue the conversation with you outside this event. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to share a couple ways that you can get in touch both with WEBS and with ODF&W for additional questions. I think that's all of my announcements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony. I'm going to stop my screen share here. And Tony, you should be able to share now.
Okay, getting ready to.
That looks good on our end.
Okay, I just wanted to confirm that everything Looks good there. Then, good evening, everyone. As Marina said, my name's Tony D'Andrea. I'm the lead for the Shellfish and Estuarine Assessment of Coastal Oregon, or SEACOR project. And today I'm going to give you an overview of eelgrass ecology research and monitoring in the Tillamook County estuaries. So the talk tonight will cover four aspects of eelgrass. I'll start with an introduction to eelgrass biology, do a section on the role of eelgrass in Oregon estuaries, talk about recent losses of eelgrass in Pacific Northwest estuaries and risks to eelgrass that exist. And then I'll talk a bit on the last half of the talk on what my program and ODFW are done as far as eelgrass monitoring and research to better understand this resource in the state. So, what is eelgrass? So, eelgrass are actually aquatic flowering plants. So, they live fully submerged in estuaries and nearshore areas. They're associated with soft sediments and shallow waters in most Oregon estuaries. So when I talk about shallow waters, typically waters that are less than 2 meters deep. And they can be quite large as plants. And because of this, they're among the major primary producers in estuaries. They occur in these dense meadows or beds, and this complex structure helps trap and stabilize sediments and improve water quality. And this complex structure of eelgrass beds are an important habitat for many invertebrates and fish. And I'll talk about that today. So there's several requirements for an area to be amenable for eelgrass to persist. So eelgrass can only photosynthesize when they're fully submerged in water. So they're typically along the edges of tide flats or in the subtidal channels or in that really low intertidal area. They need an anchoring system to persist in an environment with large changes in tides and lots of waves and other physical disturbance that happens within estuaries. They require sufficient light to photosynthesize. They need an ample supply of nutrients, and they are most successful at moderate temperatures. So those are kind of like those basic characteristics that would lead to success for eelgrass. And for this, they have a number of morphological adaptations that help assist them with this. So they have these flattened strap-like leaves that can be up to 2 meters long. So that allows them to be deeper in the water and still have leaves up in light. They're salt tolerant and also light sensitive in that relative to other plants, they can photosynthesize at fairly low levels of light. They have an extensive root rhizome system. That is how they anchor within the tide flat systems. They can take nutrient uptake through both their leaves and their roots, and that they can expand both through sexual reproduction. So they have seeds and pollination like you would for a flowering plant. In fact, the photo on the left here has the arrow pointing to essentially a reproductive shoot that has seeds in that. And they can also expand asexually through prolific vegetative propagation. So they have rhizomes, which I'll show you the structure of those in a moment, that can just grow and expand. And so under really good conditions, they can expand the size of the eelgrass bed simply through vegetative growth. And so for the basic components of eelgrass, the part that you see above the sediment are primarily the leaves, which are long and narrow, and they tend to be in bundles uh, of leaves that are then surrounded by a leaf sheath, which is the structure just below them. There are roots that grow out of the rhizome structure beneath the leaves, um, and that this rhizome can then expand outward um, horizontally within the sediment to expand the eelgrass bed. There are two common species of eelgrass in Oregon estuaries. The primary species is the native eelgrass, Azostra marina, um, and that's commonly called eelgrass. And so this has a fairly wide range. So it's the same species in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. Um, so if you're talking about eelgrass on the east coast of the US, you're talking about the same species as we have out here on the west coast. And then the other species that occurs in Oregon estuaries is the non-native eelgrass, Zostra japonica. And so this species is actually native to Asia, but was introduced in the 1930s and has had a rapid expansion in Oregon estuaries in the 2000s. And I'll talk a little bit more about Zostra japonica when I get to kind of like the research section of the talk. But you can see here that the two eelgrass are structurally a little bit different if you look at the comparison between Zostra marina leaves, which are wider and longer, versus Zostra japonica leaves, which are narrower and shorter. So as I mentioned before, seagrasses are fully marine, and so they need to be fully submerged in order to photosynthesize. So this is in contrast to marsh plants, which can still photosynthesize when exposed to the air. So they tend to occur in the lower intertidal, the subtidal portion of estuaries. So this figure here on the right-hand side shows eelgrass distribution in Tillamook Bay. Um, from our colleagues at the EPA. And so zero here is kind of like the zero tide. So, and all of these tidal elevations are relative to mean low, lower water, which would be kind of like the numbers you would see if you looked on a tide table. But essentially, anything below, um, you don't see much eelgrass past around +2 feet relative to mean low, low water. Um, uh, So the lower limit of how deep eelgrass would occur within the estuary are driven by light availability, which does not penetrate far into your estuarine waters. Obviously, they're not the clearest water. Um, and so there's usually just a couple of meters down that you will find eelgrass because of that. And then the upper limit of eelgrass is typically driven by exposure and desiccation stress because the leaves do get damaged when they're out in the sun and start drying on the tide flats. So eelgrass leaf growth is seasonal. There's a distinct growing season from June to September, which are highlighted in these purple boxes here for this particular information on eelgrass production in Yaquina Bay. And so you have the highest productivity here and primarily from that July to September timeframe. And that for eelgrass, most of that growth is in leaves. These leaves grow continuously throughout the season, and the lifetime of a leaf ranges from 30 to 50 days. And so an eelgrass plant is continuously sloughing leaves throughout the growing season. Um, and so that's why you see lots of leaves floating around all the time. And then you tend to get a lot more leaves in the fall and winter when the fall and winter storms start hitting the estuaries, and so you start to see a lot more of the leaves being both sloughed off and lost from the plants during that time frame. So One of the reasons that eelgrass is considered important for many estuaries is really their ecological role. And so they're often called ecosystem engineers in that they modify the physical and chemical environment in which they live. And so some of the examples of how they do that is this dense leaf structure essentially protects shorelines by attenuating waves and currents because they get dampened as they pass through the seagrass bed. Um, I mentioned earlier that these leaves slow down currents between the leaves and allow sediment to settle out, so it traps and stabilizes sediments. It has an important role in nutrient cycling, in particular because it uses a lot of nutrients during photosynthesis. Um, and then for ocean acidification and hypoxia, the photosynthesis by seagrasses can mediate the effects of ocean acidification. And so, just a quick reminder that when they're um, having high rates of photosynthesis, they're taking up lots of carbon dioxide into the leaves and then releasing oxygen. And then in a study done in Washington State, it showed that eelgrass beds are much less acidic during the daytime when they're actively photosynthesizing relative to other either bear or oyster aquaculture type habitats that can also exist in these estuarine tide flats. In addition, because they have these root and rhizome systems, there can be long-term storage of carbon in eelgrass beds. And so that's this concept called blue carbon as a way to kind of mediate the global carbon cycle is essentially storing that carbon long-term within the sediments rather than having it cycling within the oceans. They also create living habitat. There are seagrass specific herbivores, and so the most common herbivore that you would see in the Netarts Bay area would be brant geese when they are stopping in Netarts Bay during their winter stopover, and you can see them actively feeding on eelgrass, trying to get to essentially the sheath and the root rhizome area of the plants. And then the plants themselves create their own mini ecosystem. And so in this paired photo here on the left shows what we call epiphytes. And so that just means growth on the eelgrass blades. And so this is a combination of small algae as well as macroalgae that actually grow actively on the eelgrass blades. And all of this material is basically food to a small community of invertebrates called mesograzers, which includes things like amphipods, isopods, snails, and sea hares that you can see on the plants. And under conditions where these mesograzers are abundant, essentially they can keep the eelgrass blade clean of these epiphytes. But essentially, these invertebrates really wouldn't exist in the estuary without the presence of eelgrass, since the eelgrass itself is creating that habitat for them. This eelgrass structure also enhances biodiversity. So this complex blade structure provides protection for small invertebrates and fishes. So many of the predatory fishes are visual predators, and so obviously it's harder to find the smaller invertebrates and fishes when you also have to find your way through the complex blades of the eelgrass bed. And that this leaf structure, similar to the way that it traps sediments, it can also trap the larvae that are in the water column. And so it concentrates a lot of these invertebrate species. And so they're rich food resources here. And so down here on the bottom here is a study that was done in Equina Bay that just showed the epibenthic communities that exist on an open tide flat area in Equina Bay relative to within an eelgrass bed. And so you can see a lot more different species and a lot bigger animals in that. And so that's high biodiversity and biomass are characteristic of those eelgrass habitats. And since I'm a shellfish biologist, I'll show an example for clams. And so this is on the left, this map shows a portion of Tillamook Bay, called Bay Ocean North. The different shades of blue represent different densities of eelgrass, with the darker shades representing denser eelgrass. And these purple circles here represent relative density of gaper clams. And so you can see from the map itself that almost all of the gaper clams are associated with where there is eelgrass. And that shows up here if you were to compare the gaper clam density in eelgrass versus unvegetated areas of this area. There's 17 times higher gaper clam density found in eelgrass relative to the unvegetated areas. And so these are important for many of the shellfish in our estuaries. It's also an important nursery area. And when I talk about a nursery area, I'm thinking it from the ecological perspective, in that a nursery area is kind of defined as an area where juveniles of different species have high abundance, growth, and survival. And so some common examples of this that you can see in our estuary is on the photo on the left here is herring laying eggs on eelgrass blades, juvenile Chinook salmon that when they are spending time within the estuaries as part of their life cycle, they're um, they're found within eelgrass beds. And then Dungeness crab, which prefer eelgrass bed as a structured habitat during their early life stages. And I have this little video here that I took when we were working in Coos Bay, and just were able to capture a pretty cool event where all these baby crabs had settled like the night before we came out onto the tide flat at low tide. And so we were able to see them kind of like swarming on the tide flat surface, trying to find their spots in the eelgrass bed. And so these different ecosystem services I've described form the basis for the protection and conservation of eelgrass and estuaries. And so for different federal and state agencies, there's different levels of protection for eelgrass because of these ecosystem services. And so for federal agencies such as NOAA Fisheries, eelgrass is considered essential fish habitat. For the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it's a habitat of particular concern. So that means if you are doing some type of project within estuaries that could impact eelgrass, you would have to describe how your activities limit the damage to eelgrass. And if you do damage eelgrass, how are you going to mitigate for that damage to replace that resource within the system? Within the state of Oregon, uh, native eelgrass is an Oregon conservation strategy species and is also in our Oregon nearshore strategy. And that the primary agencies responsible for management of eelgrass are Department of State Lands and the Oregon Coastal Management Program, which all have roles either for submerged or submersible lands and or coastal land planning goals. And then ODFW's primary role is consulting with these other agencies that issue permits, but also monitoring of eelgrass, which is what I'll talk about for a good portion of the talk today. However, eelgrass is an at-risk species. It's declining globally. Declines have been noted in numerous locations worldwide, and 24 species of seagrass have been affected by these declines, including eelgrass. There are lots of different potential factors that lead to losses of eelgrass. Some of the big ones are poor water quality, dredge and fill activities, and other types of anthropogenic effects, as well as climate change and sea level rise, which have a unknown impact on eelgrass as far as what their trajectories will be under those climate change conditions. And so we saw this for many of you who were around in the mid 2015s. Um, uh, there were a couple big eelgrass loss events that were documented. So one was in Morro Bay in California. And so these two maps here show from their eelgrass mapping program the dramatic loss in eelgrass in a very short time period. In essentially less than a decade, they had a 95% loss. And similarly, in the South Slough Reserve in Coos Bay, Oregon, um, this was a tide flat that had extensive eelgrass beds in the early 2000s, and by 2017 had also seen a 95% decrease in eelgrass. So obviously this was distressing to many eelgrass biologists and resource managers. We did get together for a workshop in 2019 to kind of understand what those causes are and talk about what major stressors might be there to stimulate research on that. Um, I'm not going to go through this list, but essentially it's a lot of the classic things for eelgrass: temperature, habitat loss, nutrients, sea level rise, and extreme events um, are were the kind of key stressors that were identified in that workshop. And so, subsequent to that, did we have any idea of why some of these losses happened? And the answer is kind of yes. Um, so, um, what do we know about that loss? Well, in 2014 to 2016 was a climate event called the Blob. That was for those of you who were in the Pacific Northwest during that time frame are well aware of the Blob. But essentially, this was a marine heat wave event in the Northeast Pacific, and that this marine heat wave lasted up to 200 days at temperatures that are high enough to cause stress in eelgrass, and that it seemed like shallow estuaries, so estuaries with shallow channels and less upwelling, which would be um, uh, estuaries in Oregon on the north coast going into Washington, that were more impacted than deeper estuaries and those on the middle and southern coast of Oregon. And so this is a figure here for Netarts Bay that shows that time period from 2014 to 2016. And this kind of green line here represents the kind of like upper limit of tolerance for eelgrass before you start seeing losses. And all of the red colored temperature record here are time periods where the temperature in Netarts Bay was exceeding those and could be an impact. On the right here was monitoring that was done both pre, during, and after that marine heat wave event. And the uh, eelgrass was at a much higher level prior to the event, started to decrease as the event proceeded, and that for Netarts Bay, the recovery was fairly long, in that it was multiple years where the effect of that marine heat wave was still persisting within Netarts, which was one of these shallow estuaries with less upwelling. But as depressing as that is, I do want to give you a like a success story as well. So Morro Bay, which was that bay that we talked about that had that 95% loss in 2015, this is what it looks like now in 2023. So it's actually almost double what it was in 2007, um, just 8 years after this was down to almost 13 acres. Um, Morro Bay did have some advantages over other estuaries. It is part of the National Estuary Program, and they had long established eelgrass monitoring research and restoration programs, which likely aided in the recovery. But the idea being that, yes, those impacts from marine heat waves can impact the estuaries, the eelgrass and estuaries, but there is still recovery that can happen after that. And at least in the terms of biologically speaking, this is a fairly short time frame to be in less than a decade of recovery. So I mentioned that ODFW has a role in monitoring and research on eelgrass, and so what I'd like to talk about is kind of like three projects that my team have been involved with. Um, I'll start with um, looking at eelgrass distribution in Tillamook Bay, since we just recently completed the Tillamook Bay survey. Um, Shellfish species associations with native and non-native eelgrass in Netarts Bay, and then emerging technologies that we're starting to incorporate into our work to map eelgrass. So I'll start with eelgrass distribution in Tillamook Bay. And so the project, as Marina had introduced, is the Shellfish and Estuarine assessment of coastal Oregon. So our primary mandate is to do estuary resource inventory surveys and generate baseline data on clam populations and habitats. Um, and so we do things like spatial distribution and community composition, um, climate abundance, biomass, and size distribution. But from the habitat perspective, characterizing eelgrass is one of the important components of our field surveys. And the goal there is to better manage bay clam and habitat resources and establish baselines that exist in Oregon estuaries. And so SEACOR has been in a number of estuaries. Our primary four estuaries that we visit every decade are Tillamook, Netarts Bay, Yaquina Bay, and Coos Bay. And we recently finished up Tillamook Bay, and that's results that I'll talk about in a moment. We're in the middle of our Yaquina Bay survey, and then starting in 2027, we'll be back in Netarts Bay for 2 years to repeat the surveys that we did in 2013 and 2014. And so our recent survey in Tillamook Bay was 3 years from 2022 to 2024. We surveyed 7 intertidal regions that are outlined here across those 3 years. And in particular, I'm going to focus on this area here that I already talked about for gaper clams, which is Bay Ocean North, for both portions of the talk on eelgrass distribution, as well as our section on emerging technologies that we're incorporating. When we design studies for these surveys, we have 2 types of habitat sampling, grid sites and random sites. So grid sites, so all of these white points here are sites that we sampled in the Tillamook Bay survey. So it's over 1,100 sites. So the way we do grid sites is essentially the idea is to set these broad grids, in this case, 100 by 100 meter grids in most regions. And then we go to each of these points and take data on habitat using quadrats. And among the data that we collect is specifically eelgrass related, looking at eelgrass species, so looking at both native and non-native eelgrass, density, cover, and distribution. And so in addition to these grid sites, we also have random habitat sites. And so these are sites that are randomized by region of the estuary and tidal elevation. And we go in initially at low tide and do the same type of habitat surveys that we would do at the grid sites, but we then come back to that identical site later when there's water over the tide flat, and then we use a mega coring system that we developed to essentially extractively measure the shellfish at that location. And so this allows us to have information on both the habitat that was at that site and the shellfish found at that site, so we can do analyses related to identifying what are the important habitat types for the different species of shellfish in these estuaries. And so this map on the left here shows sites during that survey where eelgrass was found. So we had 604, or about a third of the total sites had eelgrass present at the site. So all of these dots are relative density of eelgrass, with larger dots representing higher densities of eelgrass. And so we take this raw field data and then conduct a spatial interpolation of that data, and then it produces essentially this map on the right-hand side, which is essentially a distribution map of the density of eelgrass found within Tillamook Bay during the survey. So this shows the density and extent of the eelgrass beds in the bay. And again, here is that Bay Ocean North area that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And so the biggest take homes here are that eelgrass is broadly distributed in Tillamook Bay. This figure here to the right shows the tidal elevations where the eelgrass was found. And so essentially the almost all of the eelgrass was found in tide heights less than 0.5 meters relative to mean low water. And that there's fairly extensive eelgrass here. So like I mentioned, there are many Pacific Northwest estuaries that have seen some of these dramatic losses. That does not seem to be the case in Tillamook Bay, and I'll show you that in even more detail in a moment. Because that's the big question is, has eelgrass distribution changed? And so for Tillamook Bay, we actually have 3 time points where on this Bay Ocean North Flat, we have measured this eelgrass distribution. And so we can compare among those time frames to see whether there's a distribution or amount of eelgrass that has changed over that time frame. So the first study was done by the EPA lab in Newport in 2005. And during their survey of this region, they found just almost 51 acres of eelgrass in 2005. My team surveyed this area in 2011, and then we found 65 acres of eelgrass at that location. And then the results that I just showed you today for 2022, the eelgrass has actually expanded even more, and we're at almost 94 acres of eelgrass on this location. And so in a time frame of 17 years, we've seen an almost doubling of eelgrass coverage in this Bay Ocean North region of Tillamook Bay. So it just is a very positive thing to see that there's both extensive eelgrass beds and that these have been expanding over the last couple of decades. So now that we know that there's eelgrass there, what types of shellfish are associated with eelgrass? And in this case, I'll talk a little bit about non-native eelgrass because this next study was done in Netarts Bay. And so the non-native eelgrass, Zostera japonica, has been expanding in Pacific Northwest. So it's sometimes called Japanese eelgrass or dwarf eelgrass. It was accidentally introduced to the Pacific Northwest from Japan in the 1930s when we were importing essentially oysters for oyster aquaculture, and that it looks like some of the Zostera japonica and Zostera japonica seeds were part of the packing materials that the oysters were transported to the West Coast in. And so this species is present from British Columbia to Northern California, and there's been a rapid expansion in Oregon estuaries in the last 25 years. And so why have they been successful? They kind of have a lot of weedy life history characteristics that you see for a lot of non-native species. They have a high salinity and temperature tolerance. They have a very high flowering rate, so they can rapidly expand both vegetatively and with seeds, and they occur in extremely high shoot densities relative to Zostera marina. And that they're colonizing areas that are typically unvegetated. And so most areas in Oregon estuaries where we see a lot of Zostra japonica. They tend to occur in the higher tidal elevations where you don't really see native eelgrass in many of those areas. There is, however, one exception, and that's Netarts Bay. And so there are 4 different types of eelgrass um, bed types that you can see in Netarts Bay and that can often be seen at the same tide height. And so you have areas where it's just the native eelgrass, Zostra marina. There are areas where it's mixed beds of both the native and non-native species, areas where it's just the non-native species, and then unvegetated areas in the bay. And I have kind of photos down here just to show what those different areas look like. And so I'm not going to go into detail on this, but essentially this is that same type of um, sampling approach that I described for Tillamook Bay that we also did in Netarts Bay, as far as the habitat only grid sites and the habitat and shellfish random sites that were sampled in the 2013-2014 Netarts Bay survey. And so from this, then I could then map out the different those 4 different eelgrass bed types. And so the take home here is that those eelgrass bed types that include the non-native eelgrass, which includes both Zostra japonica and these mixed beds, are about 30% of the intertidal area in Netarts Bay at the time of the survey, included those ones. However, if we looked at a previous survey that was done in the 1970s, so like it was 40 something years before that survey, there's really no change in the distribution of the native eelgrass. And that most of those mixed beds where both species occurred were actually still dominated by the native eelgrass. So at that time, it looked like that the non-native eelgrass colonized the unvegetated upper intertidal areas and expanded down into Zostra marina beds, but they were not the dominant eelgrass there. And so for identifying the shellfish communities in the different eelgrass bed types, we focused on one section of the intertidal, which is this high intertidal area between 0.5 and 1 meters relative to mean low water. And that's where all 4 of these habitat types existed. And so if we then looked at the shellfish communities that existed within those, we conducted an analysis that basically tested whether or not shellfish community structure could be by itself could be used to distinguish which seagrass bed type we expect. And there was this gradient in native to mixed to non-native eelgrass that seemed to be predictable from the composition of the shellfish that were found at the various sites. And so what were those compositions? And so there are some species that are characteristic of a particular eelgrass bed type, and they're represented by this asterisk. So in the case of eelgrass, the native eelgrass locations, one of the species that were only found there was the pointed Macoma or Macoma inquinata. But there was also the largest biomass of juvenile Dungeness crab and mud shrimp also occurring within those habitats. There's then a series of species that characterize a single habitat. So in this case, it was the soft-shell clam that characterized the non-native eelgrass habitat, and then the purple varnish clam that characterized the unvegetated habitats in Netarts Bay. And then there's kind of like a third group of shellfish, which were more cosmopolitan species in that they were found across all these different habitat types, but they were found in different densities. And so the highest densities of butter clams and the pointed macoma were within these native eelgrass beds, whereas there was a mix of those different species at different biomass and densities in these other habitat types. So what does this all kind of mean? Well, it seems like the non-native eelgrass has colonized intertidal habitat, altered the types of eelgrass bed types that we found, especially at those higher tide heights greater than that plus 0.5 meter. That the native eelgrass is still the dominant eelgrass in the bay, and its distribution has been stable since the 1970s. That there were predictable differences in shellfish community structure in each eelgrass bed type, and kind of the challenge from the putting on my shellfish management hat is that both native and non-native eelgrass habitats supported populations of recreationally important bivalves. And so at least in this case, we don't see the dramatic negative effect of the non-native eelgrass on some of the recreationally and commercially important bivalves that occur in our estuaries. And so I'd like to kind of finish up the talk by talking about emerging technologies that we're starting to incorporate into our eelgrass mapping efforts at ODFW. And so I showed you this figure earlier of how we map data from our field studies. However, there are some limitations to these maps from the field studies. They're time and labor intensive. As I mentioned, it was a 3-year effort to get this data for Tillamook Bay. It's fairly low spatial resolution. Some of those sites were separated by tens of meters. And so it's a fairly low resolution of kind of like 10 to 30 meters scale. And that since we only resample these estuaries every 10 years, that is a fairly low temporal resolution, to go every 10 years when, if there's an event such as a marine heat wave, we might have missed that entirely between the 2 decades that we sample. And so we're exploring methods to overcome some of these issues. And so one that we have been using for the last 10 years is uncrewed aircraft systems, or UAS, or drones. And so our primary goals in incorporating drones is to kind of evaluate their potential for eelgrass mapping, to be able to improve the spatiotemporal resolution of eelgrass distribution maps that we can produce, understand the trade-offs and limitations of those technologies on how they can be used and employed, and to integrate these with our field surveys. And so we've been doing this since about 2016, and much of that work was done in this small 2.5 acre site in Netarts Bay. And so this is an example aerial image from one of these drone flights. And so in this one, remember I had mentioned that it was 10 to 20 meters resolution. Here it's 6 millimeters resolution, in that we could see fine details of the eelgrass in here that we wouldn't be able to get from our other maps. And more importantly, that we can cover fairly large areas. And so using these UAS, we can cover 100 to 200 acres per day. Again, being able to cover large areas much more rapidly than we could by just using the on-foot surveys. And that these UAS can show shifts in vegetation. And so these are 2 flights of the same area in 2016 and 2017. These blue areas represent eelgrass extent, and just for purposes here, I've combined both native and non-native eelgrass in the one color. And then we also had 2 different types of algae that we mapped in the orange and yellow color. And so you can see that from year to year, you have some shifts in where you find eelgrass, the edges of the eelgrass beds, and that the presence and distribution of other vegetation can also differ from year to year. So we were able to capture that in these images. And if we overlay the 2016 and 2017 eelgrass for this region, with the 2016 flights being the darker blue, and then overlaying in lighter blue the 2017 flights, what we found was that there were some shifts in eelgrass extent. And in fact, it looks like that the eelgrass extent shrunk in 2017 relative to 2016. Well, if you remember when we talked about the marine heat wave and netarts, um, 2016 and 2017 were those periods where we were seeing some of the dramatic decreases in eelgrass within Netarts Bay because of the marine heat wave. And in fact, from 2016 to 2017, there was a 36% decrease in eelgrass that was recorded for Netarts Bay between those 2 years, and that this showed essentially a 30% decrease in eelgrass in this particular area that we studied with the drones. So it's fairly consistent with what was observed broadly across this across this estuary. And so that's something that kind of illustrates kind of how the UAS eelgrass mapping addresses some of the spatial temporal dynamics that can be quantified using this method. And then since 2023, we've shifted from Netarts Bay to Tillamook Bay for our UAS flights, with a focus on 5 regions of the bay with known eelgrass beds that were monitored by ODFW and Oregon State University. And again, I'm going to focus on this Bay Ocean North area that we've already spent some time on. And so this is what the drone imagery for that area is. And so this yellow box define what the flight region for these UAS flights. And so you can see essentially sandy areas here, and then eelgrass and these deeper areas with eelgrass as well on both sides of essentially this channel that occurred within Bay Ocean North. And then we can apply spatial analysis to this in order to classify in throughout this area in our 1 centimeter kind of pixels, whether it was eelgrass present or unvegetated area. And you can see there's strong correspondence between what was classified as eelgrass and what you can see visually in the images from the drone flights. And then if we then compare it to what our field-based classified eelgrass is, you can see that if we just go to this section of the image, you can see here that we have a portion that's unvegetated, then eelgrass, then unvegetated, and eelgrass. But from our field surveys, because of the coarseness of those surveys, essentially it's identified as if it's end-to-end eelgrass. And so you can kind of see kind of the increased accuracy that we get from estimating the eelgrass distribution using drones. And more importantly, which is illustrated here, is that the UAS imagery does a better job in distinguishing kind of the edges of the eelgrass bed from unvegetated areas, and that potentially that our field-based classification of eelgrass could overestimate kind of the eelgrass extent that we see within the estuary. And so kind of take-homes from the use of the UAS technology is that it can be a powerful tool for monitoring eelgrass, that we can produce these high-resolution eelgrass habitat maps. We've been able to track spatial and temporal dynamics, although when we were doing the Netarts study, we weren't thinking of it as a way to track marine heat waves, because we were in the middle of the marine heat wave at the time. That these data sets can complement our field surveys, and that, obviously, whenever you're trying to incorporate a new method in, we need to kind of work on kind of like the best practices and when it is best to kind of use this type of technology. And so I hope I've given you a little guided tour of how cool eelgrass can be and things we're doing to kind of better understand eelgrass and Oregon estuaries. And I will pass it back to Marina to moderate some questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Um, Really, really appreciate this opportunity to hear directly from you about the super current work and relevant research that you're doing. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. We do have a couple questions in the chat, so I'm gonna start there. And as a reminder, you can keep adding questions to the chat as we continue talking. We've got about 20 minutes for Q&A here. Um, so first question here, are there any incentives currently in play to propagate eelgrass, perhaps rhizome division or tissue culture?
Um, Not so much in that way to propagate eelgrass. What is starting to be shared and discussed among like eelgrass restoration practitioners on the West Coast is in places like on the East Coast and Chesapeake Bay that have seen much more dramatic losses than we have had on the West Coast in eelgrass. They have a long history of actually collecting and creating nurseries to collect seeds and then using the seeds to then spread back out as a restoration as a way to kind of propagate eelgrass into new locations. And so that's one of the new methods that is being discussed to try to promote for the West Coast, because primarily when we've kind of restored or tried to expand eelgrass, we would actually take it from another eelgrass bed called a donor bed, and we would take a chunk of eelgrass out of there and then plant it at the new location. And then with the idea being that the donor bed is usually a fairly dense eelgrass bed that can quickly fill in that area that we've taken it from. And then the hope is then that um, eelgrass would take and grow in that new location. And the things that's promising for the seed approach is it's a lot less expensive and labor intensive as the other approach, and that even that the historic approach that's been used in on the West Coast has had a fairly low success rate in that you're lucky to get over 50% success in the one where you're taking eelgrass from another location and planting it in your restoration site.
Interesting. Thank you. And then I guess let's piggyback on that question. We have another question. You showed us the maps from Morro Bay in California, which had a really dramatic increase in eelgrass after the 90%, 95%, I think, drop. So how did that happen? And what did human involvement look like in that recovery?
Yeah, it was very similar to both of the examples that I gave for the Pacific Northwest, ironically, are the ones that have long-term monitoring programs. So South Slough is a National Estuarine Research Reserve near Charleston and Coos Bay, and so they had been doing monitoring of that particular eelgrass bed for over a decade when that dramatic loss happened. And for Morro Bay, they had been doing it for almost 2 decades as a national estuary program. And so the kind of, I would say, advantage that they had is that they already had a portion of their program that was involved in restoration. So it was very easy to mobilize them, and that they had a very interested and motivated local community that wanted to make sure that eelgrass came back to that bay. And
Mhm.
so those are all pretty important components for successful restoration.
Thank you. All right, next question. We're wondering if you can talk a little bit about how ODFW and other agencies are working with aquaculture industries to address impacts on eelgrass from mechanical means of aquaculture.
Yeah. So, not an uncommon question to expect. Um, so, there are a few leases that exist within the state of Oregon that do have mechanical harvesting. And so, for those not aware of it, one of the aquaculture techniques is that oysters slowly settle into the sediment as they grow. And so there's this technique called harrowing where they um, essentially drag the surface of their oyster lease area and bring the oysters back up to the surface. And then others also then use that mechanical means to actually harvest the oysters in their lease area. And so, in the time I have been with the Shellfish program, and so that's 15 years that we've seen new um, oyster uh, lease applications. None have included mechanical harvest because that's not something that is something that we promote or encourage. And in fact, even the federal partners, which would be the major players in any type of new leases with mechanical harvest, also would say that it would be an extensive permit process with them in order to have a new lease that would include that. And that was part of the reason that one of the um, lease applications from Pacific Seafood was ultimately pulled from Tillamook Bay, was because the Army Corps of Engineers and NOAA Fisheries had clearly stated with them the process and costs that would be involved for them to have that be a part of their lease. As far as the state agencies, ODFW does not have a direct role in any of those decision making. Oregon Department of Agriculture is exclusively mandated with managing aquaculture and mariculture leases on state lands. Department of State Lands is the agency that actually has the um, um, role and power to affect impacts of eelgrass on those types of activities. Our role is more consultation in that we um, do share, for example, the information that my team might collect for a given location that's a proposed lease area for the eelgrass that's there, and then share with them kind of like our basic requirements as far as um, uh, how much oyster aquaculture can occur in different thresholds of eelgrass density and at what point they can't do any eelgrass aquaculture. But there has been, a need at least for the last 5 years or so to kind of have some better coordination among the agencies that are involved in this, and that is definitely an issue. It's just when we have new oyster leases, we only get like one every 2 or 3 years. So it's usually not like a super high priority work wise until it happens.
Thank you. Next question we have, I'm gonna read this one so you can hear the story. So when we go little neck clamming in the southern portion of Netarts Bay, we do it by walking around barefoot and then picking up clams when we step on them. How much damage are we doing to the eelgrass, and what should we be doing to minimize or eliminate the damage?
Yeah, a difficult question. um, there is some capability for eelgrass to recover from disturbance such as that. It's a type of disturbance that eelgrass has long been exposed to, and obviously, you know, my team for a couple of years every decade do very similar types of disturbance throughout the different bays. The best kind of recommendation and the recommendation that I usually give in clamming clinics is just identify areas either on the edge of the eelgrass bed or just off the eelgrass bed if it's possible, and utilize those areas to minimize that disturbance, because typically you still have the same densities of the clams in those locations as you do within the eelgrass.
Great. And then we've got another question that's going to kind of build on that one, which is that clamming has become very popular in the last several years in Netarts Bay. Is this having ill effects on the clam population or on eelgrass?
Yeah. Um, Unclear. Not an easy answer. If you talk to me in like 3 years after I've spent 2 years in Netarts, I could give you a better answer. Um, I know that I've been involved with clamming clinics in the main recreationally important area there in Netarts Bay, around the Shellfish kiosks, for about 15 years. And there's been ebbs and flows in the clam populations there, but in generally they have been high. That the one of the main ways that we kind of track whether that population in between kind of the main kind of big surveys that like my team does is to track from the recreational harvest effort whether they're what's the catch per unit effort, and whether that catch per unit effort of the recreational users of that resource are staying uh, staying the same, increasing, decreasing, because that gives a general idea of, for the harvestable size population, um, uh, what those relative amounts of those clams in that location can be. I know that I think we are just now starting a small study in Tillamook Bay to start looking at at primarily cockle populations on a couple of the tide flats, and trying to visit those sites on an annual basis, so that we have, between the large SEACOR surveys every 10 years, then we have an idea of kind of like the ebb and flow of the clam populations in on an annual basis, to be able to respond if there are um, major changes in those populations that we see.
Mhm. We'll be excited to hear more about what you learn in Netarts Bay in the next few years. We'll
I
have, we'll
imagine
have
so.
you back for another presentation soon. Um, Great. Okay, I see one more question in here for the time being, which is within Tillamook Bay, are you seeing any correlation between eelgrass abundance and acidity? And can you expand a bit on anthropogenic nutrients and adverse effects on the eelgrass?
Sure, I can answer the second one easier than the first one. We, as in ODFW, is not directly measuring acidity, so I can't quite correlate that. That might be a question for the Tillamook Estuaries Partnership and their monitoring, in partnership with the EPA, on whether they're maintaining that type of data set to do that. But I can talk a bit about nutrients and adverse effects on eelgrass, and say that it seems like um, nutrients aren't a major negative impact on eelgrass on the west coast of the U.S. that they are on the east coast. So the pattern with excess nutrients, particularly anthropogenic nutrients, on the east coast estuaries is that as more and more nutrients come into the system, it actually favors growth of the benthic macroalgae over eelgrass. And then that algae and the phytoplankton that are blooming with all those nutrients start to shade out the eelgrass, and then there's eelgrass loss. wherever it seems. And my colleagues at the EPA did a number of these experiments, and I was involved in some field experiments where we are intentionally increasing nutrients in eelgrass to see if there were effects. And it just seems that West Coast eelgrass beds naturally get very high levels of nutrients every year due to the upwelling system that drives a lot of the coastal ecosystems in on the West Coast and particularly the Pacific Northwest, that they are more adapted to very high levels of those nutrients. And so even under high nutrient conditions, the eelgrass is still um, outcompeting the macroalgae even when the macroalgae are blooming.
Great. Thank you for giving us such in-depth answers. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I'm going to share my screen again before we wrap up here, but you've got a couple more minutes. So if there's any lingering questions, please add them in. We do have a few more minutes. Um, and I'm gonna go ahead and share this in the meantime. All right. So, as we're wrapping up here, I want to again say a huge thank you to Tony for sharing your expertise with us today. And another reminder that this is only the first in a series of talks on all of the wonderful producers that we have in Netarts Bay that fuel the whole ecosystem, really. So, I hope that you'll join us again in the next couple months for the next events coming up in that series. Um, I also hope that before you leave today, you will scan the QR code on the screen to take a survey and let us know what you thought of this event and also what additional topics you would like to learn about. I'm also going to drop that link in the chat if that's easier for anybody. Let's make sure I'm sending this to everybody. Oops, that's the Zoom link, not the survey link. One moment. And while I'm working on this, I'll also just point out that on the screen, there is information about how you can get in touch with WEBs. And there's also information on how you can get in touch with the SEACOR team at ODFW. We are all here at this presentation because we love eelgrass and we love talking about eelgrass. So we would be really happy to hear from you and to continue this conversation. Um, so please don't be a stranger and reach out to us at Webs, reach out to Tony at ODFW, and we will get back to you and continue talking about this. The link is in the chat now, so you can click on that and just answer a couple super quick questions to share your thoughts. We do use this information when we're planning our next events. So with that, I'm going to again say thank you and then say good night to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Have a good rest of your Wednesday evening. Right.